from France. I read about you in an article of the Republica. You have the green hand. And so what type of agriculture do you use or do you prefer? And what is your position about Bayer and glyphosate? Why does it take so much time to forbid it? Thank you.
Sì, buongiorno.
Yes, good afternoon. Well, of course, for quite some time, our Parliament has been dealing with a lot of these kind of issues. Some of those issues are somehow suspended or frozen. At the moment, the way we're approaching agricultural issues has been somewhat subsumed by the Green Deal and the pandemic. Some of the issues that we were dealing with before the pandemic now need to be worked on again. In the agricultural sector, we've been trying to achieve the objectives that we've set ourselves at the beginning of the parliamentary term. So by 2030 and 2050, the efforts that the agricultural sector is making are going to have to work towards making Europe more green. We want a Europe that is capable of growing, but also keeping the planet in a safe place. That's why agricultural issues are constantly returning to the fore. And I think now, when we work on the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, we should also be working on these fronts. So the European Parliament is going to have to work very carefully on subjects like pesticides. Of course, pesticides have to be compatible with the objectives that the Green Deal has set.
Prego.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel will speak on the agenda of the German EU Council presidency on Wednesday. What political actions do you expect in the next 6 months from Germany?
Ma abbiamo visto con grande interesse.
Well, we were very interested to see the priorities of the German 6-month presidency, and I think they're fully in line with our requirements today. We need a Europe that relaunches all member states' economies, and we need citizens to be in a position to emerge from this terrible situation. This week, as you'll be aware, we're holding a lot of meetings. The German presidency will be launched in plenary. I will be holding a bilateral meeting with Chancellor Merkel, and we've all been invited by the President of the Commission to the Berlaymont building for the launch of the interinstitutional negotiations on the MFF. It's not a summit, as has been written in some places. This is the triggering of a treaty article which launches interinstitutional negotiations. And the President of the Council, Charles Michel, has also been invited to that meeting to present the Council's position. Interinstitutional negotiations are launched following the triggering of Article 324 of the treaty, and that involves the President of the Parliament and the rotating presidency of the European Union. I don't know how long these negotiations will last, of course. It'll depend on the points of view that people hold. But what is clear is that we as a Parliament will be emphasising our position. We can't move backwards. we can't call into question the amounts that were established by the Commission's plan. We have to have an appropriate timetable which includes dates when own resources will come into force. And then on the MFF we want to discuss a few budget lines that we're not particularly happy about, and in particular, given that we're talking to young people and about young people, I'm talking the budget lines that relate to culture, Erasmus and research. I think this entire field requires certain adjustments, because we can't make cuts to the funding available to young people if we want young people to be the future of Europe. I hope we're going to do a good job here. Obviously everyone's aware that the Parliament has the last word on this, so given that, I thought it was very important that President von der Leyen really paid a particular attention to the Parliament, because we all do have to make a joint effort here. We need to say to the other institutions that we are piling debt on future generations. Whether we go for loans or subsidies, that's what's going to happen. And so what we have to do is give them more capacity. That has to be the message that we're going to send across. We have to put young generations in a position in which they can achieve higher standards of well-being. So we're seeing this higher level of debt, but in exchange we want to see young people in a position to achieve more well-being, as I say. I also think that the COVID pandemic has shown how our social model is really key for the lives of our citizens. And this is something that needs to be boosted. So we need to relaunch things from here, but I have faith and I think we will achieve our goals, because I see that everyone really is working very hard on this. Thank you.
Hello, President Sassoli. I have a question about fisheries. Irish fishermen are very worried that if the EU loses access to UK waters in Brexit trade talks, they'll be flooded with other EU fleets. Is it possible to retain EU access to UK waters in a way that's fair to the UK? And how do you think Brexit trade talks have gone so far after face-to-face negotiations last week?
Ma guardi, io...
Well, I did have a meeting with Mr. Johnson 2 weeks ago, together with President von der Leyen and President Charles Michel. We repeated our position. We want an agreement. We don't understand why we shouldn't be making every possible effort to ensure that there's an orderly Brexit. The European side and the British need to be in a position to work together, live together, even under different conditions. But what we've understood is that this path forward seems to be somewhat more difficult than we'd imagined. I haven't seen any great desire on the part of the British authorities for achieving an agreement that's satisfying to all by the end of this year. I hope that this attitude will change. But I think it has to be very clear that if there is no agreement, then our relationship will have to be ruled by other rules, the WTO rules, which I think would be worse than an agreement. I think that would be the wrong approach to take. If things end up that way, well, it's just the wrong solution. It's the wrong solution for our citizens, for our peoples, for our institutions too. we face common challenges that we need to overcome, and we're linked by a deep sense of friendship. So if there is no agreement, that will be the wrong solution. But at the same time, you can't make use of the European single market if you are not part of the European Union. Or you can get access through an agreement, but if there's no agreement, then we consider this to be relations with a third country, and all of the attendant consequences of dealing with a third country.
Presidente Sassoli, fin dall'inizio della pandemia.
President Sassoli, from the start of the pandemic, debate in Europe has focused on what Europe should have done to improve the socio-economic conditions for member states. So why does Europe constantly wait for crisis situations to improve things? I mean, we have been shown that solidarity is more necessary than ever as a result of this pandemic. And what is Europe going to do to put itself in a position to be able to help? President Sassoli, well, it's clear that emergencies create different, unpredictable situations. In February, who could have imagined that we would have had lockdowns in place across the world, that production would have stopped in so many countries, that people would be unable to move around. I mean, no one could possibly have imagined that. And clearly, in this situation, you have a before and after when it comes to the issues relating to emergencies. Well, we haven't only considered this an emergency. I mean, apart from a couple of weeks at the start when everyone was a bit unprepared and surprised at what was happening, Europe has always tried to push also for a major change in the European Union. I mean, this is not a reaction to an emergency, it's a view of how we can move forward, which is slightly different, I think. What we're going to do is use the experience of the pandemic to strengthen the European Union. We want to give the EU to grow in independence and resilience, and also in capacity. First and foremost, what we're trying to do is achieve those objectives that we'd set ourselves at the beginning of this parliamentary term. We want to become the leading continent when it comes to the fight against emissions, and that is something that we will achieve because we have a vision, which is to save the planet. If Europe doesn't step up the plate, then no one else is going to. So that's why we have to act. But in order to do that, we have to change our economy. We have to change the parameters pursuant to which we work. We need to change our way of life. We need to increase our capacity for work. I don't think all of this relates to an emergency. It's not simply a reaction. This is a strategy. Now, what we have to do today is also be pragmatic, which is why we're calling on all EU member states to act to achieve these European goals. That's the only way that Europe will be able to grow. I know that in Italy, emergencies always produce results because, for example, you manage to build bridges when you wouldn't be able to during ordinary times. But that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take a long-term view so that the EU can fulfill all its potential. And in order to do that, we're going to focus very strongly on the idea of continuing to have a transparent and strong democratic life, because our experiences over recent months have shown many things. I mean, yes, you can try and tackle emergencies, fine, everyone's tried to do that, to a greater or lesser extent, but we want to do it in a democratic manner. We don't want to see authoritarianism. And that's why what we're doing is also an effort to boost European democracy.
Buongiorno, Presidente. One question on the recovery fund and the multi-annual financial framework. You will have a meeting, as you said, with Presidents von der Leyen, Michel, and Chancellor Merkel later this week. There are a lot of expectations, but also fears that we will have or not an agreement. What's your take? We will have an agreement by the end of July, and leaders will send if they will not be able to agree. Thank you.
Beh, tutti gli sforzi.
Well, everybody is making their maximum effort to get an agreement. I don't think there'd be any point starting to discuss if we didn't have trust in each other, that we could actually do this job and bring it to a good conclusion. But nothing's to be taken for granted. But certainly, I'm trusting that we'll get a positive result from this whole process. It's in everyone's interest, particularly if Parliament's demands are heard, then I think that everything will be much easier. These instruments, the discussion on the MFF, well, it's not enough to just get an agreement in the Council. They then have to come to the Parliament with it. So I think it's a good idea to listen to the Parliament. The more they listen to the Parliament, the easier it will be to find the solutions. So I think these are going to be some very intensive weeks that we have ahead of us. We're going to be working hard. And I think that the Commission has shown some good listening skills. They want to activate Article 324, and that sends out a good signal to start a debate between the institutions that should lead to a good result. But the more the Parliament is listened to, the easier it will be to find the solutions.
Good morning, Mr. President. As you know, here in Spain, the situation has been so difficult. So I would like to know, how do you assess the management of this crisis in Spain from a European point of view?
Ma abbiamo visto un paese insieme ad altri.
Well, we've seen your country particularly affected by the COVID pandemic, as many other countries were as well, it has to be said. I mean, there were many problems, and we certainly won't forget the images of recent months. And the numbers of infected and fatalities in Spain. We saw a major positive reaction from the Spanish authorities, efforts to try and take useful measures to support Spanish citizens. And now what we need is Spain's involvement to try and ensure that the European Council will be able to adopt the appropriate measures that we need. And I think the dialogue that is ongoing at the moment between the German presidency and the countries of the south of Europe is a very productive one, a very interesting one. And there's also a strategic reason for that. I've said several times that Europe will be more united when we have shorter distances between the north and the south, as it were. And I think that the presidency's discussions with southern countries could mean that things are better than they have been in the past. In the future, it could help us to try and reduce the gap between the north and the south, so that everyone, whether northern or southern, is in a position to decide on our common future. And I think it's the right time to do that now. And that's why Spain's contribution really is key at this moment, as I think every member state's contribution is key. If the German presidency and the EU institutions act pursuant to this vision, I think that we'll be able to say that we have achieved the goals we set ourselves at the beginning of March, when everyone understood that either the European Union was boosted or it would fall apart. I don't think the EU falling apart would be good for anyone, and it didn't happen. So now we need to continue to strengthen our union. In practical terms, that means giving the European Union new instruments. We can only tackle global challenges by giving the EU new powers. And that's why one of the processes that we haven't forgotten, that will be relaunched in an even stronger and more intense manner, is the Conference on the Future of Europe, because it's from there that we have to take the elements that will enable the European Union to grow stronger. And I think that's useful for our member states and also for our citizens.
Okay. Today, if we want to travel from Amsterdam to Brussels, we can take the plane only 200 kilometers. But COVID-19 have changed the rules for airlines company. So what is your opinion? It's time to stop small flights in Europe and go back to the train?
Ma come lei sa, io...
Well, as you know, I was the rapporteur on the fourth railway package, and in my next life I will be a railwayman. But I do think that the use of trains has to be encouraged for a number of different reasons. It doesn't only give us a capacity to reduce our emissions significantly, but it also provides a way of creating infrastructure that can help our territories. I think that it would allow to use our territories in different ways than if we were using aircraft as our main means of transport. So I think that railways are a strategic issue for the European Union. I think that's only reasonable. That's why we need to ensure that we start dealing with the 10T files, the Trans-European Networks for Transport. Then we're going to have to ensure that countries and companies make the proposals their own. I think that there is an opportunity for further developing the rail sector compared to the airline sector, where we're in a better position to do that than many other continents. We've got the industry, we've got the know-how, we've got forerunning companies in the sector, and we've got capacity that others don't have. So I think that this is a sector that we could develop further, where there's a lot of potential, and Europe can be a leader. I think that we need to keep pursuing that path. If you give me a choice of whether to use the train or the plane, then I would prefer the train every time.
The national borders of the individual states were closed in the corona crisis, and even countries act for themselves today. How sustainable is the damage corona has done to the EU?
Non ho capito molto bene che cosa...
I don't fully understand what you're referring to. I apologize.
No, guardi, noi non so...
Well, Schengen never closed in Europe. We closed the external borders. Now the Commission is looking at reopening those borders. What there was controls on some of the borders, but they took place within countries as well. For example, in Italy, you couldn't travel from one city to another. In some cities, you couldn't go from one neighbourhood to another. There were some checks on the borders, and well, it's natural that they should be carried out. But closing borders is a different matter. It was the external borders that were closed. So the treaties weren't affected. There were no derogations. In addition, as you'll recall, in mid-March, sanitary and food assistance corridors were opened up between member states, guaranteed by the European Commission. So I think the situation now is going back to one in which you have states who don't have to lower their guard in terms of controls. They're making choices pursuant to their competences as member states, but there is an overall framework for security and safety. I don't know whether you've seen recently in Europe, there are certain red zones re-emerging, areas where COVID-19 continues to spread, and there obviously national authorities have a duty to take initiatives and take precautions. That doesn't, however, means that walls are being put up on our borders or Schengen's being shut down. That's a different matter. I think checks are one thing, but putting up border posts on the borders is quite another, and that wasn't done.
Hello, there's quite a bit of misinformation about the EU online lately on social media in particular. As a former journalist, are you concerned about how the EU is going to be viewed going forward, particularly when there was a slow response to the coronavirus at the start, and because a lot of young people in particular are going to be faced into austerity, perhaps for the second time in their lives?
Io sono molto preoccupato di questo.
Well, I'm very worried about that. It's a real concern. It's the response of the European Union and the member states, and if it's not going to be sufficient, then yes, indeed, this is going to endanger the future of our young people. That's why I said earlier, we are taking out debt, but we need to do it to give our younger generation a greater capacity and more opportunities. And that is the perspective that we have before us. If we get into debt, but we don't provide anything that will build a future for the younger generations, then yes, indeed, we'll be simply stealing resources from future generations. That's what we have to do, and we're very much aware of it. We're calling upon the member states and on the other institutions to ensure that they give the future its due value and to young people, so that they will not be further impoverished by this. So, what do we need? We need a clear leadership, development, work, reinforcing our social model, an economy that works towards the objectives we've set for this parliamentary term. I think these are all the ingredients that have to go into the package. The European political decision makers do have their eyes firmly on the future of younger generations.
Sassoli, l'Europa si trova in qualche...
President Sassoli, Europe is involved in this trade war and clashes between China and the US. The US is threatening to remove its troops from Germany, for example, and China is, for example, involved in some very strange diplomacy. It's using COVID, for example, to provide masks, whatever. But the question is, could the EU have a commercial policy that's independent from China and also the US? I mean, the US is a long-time ally, but there are serious divergences at the moment between Europe and the US, the president. Well, as I was saying at the beginning, what we need now is a more independent Europe. I was very pleased to note this during my exchanges with Chancellor Merkel as well, because she was talking about the need for Europe to be more resilient, more self-sufficient, for example, to the effects of global crises. But in order to do that, we need to have our own point of view. We need to bring a lot of the production that we've lost recently back to Europe, because we've delegated a lot of this production to others. And in order to do that, we need to reflect on how we can be a player on the international stage. We need to try and push the common defence project as well. I mean, I think there are a lot of ingredients required in order for the European Union to be up to tackling the challenges that we face on the global stage. It's not just one thing that we need to do to put us in the appropriate position. There are lots of things that we need to do. Having said that, we are multilateral in the way we see things, but we also have a relationship with the United States, which no political player, including the American administration, would want to undermine. Apart from anything else, in the United States, they've now started the election process, and we'll see which choices are made by future American US administrations as well. When it comes to dialogue, well, we're not out for conquest as a union. We want relations to be based on principles and the law. And I think that this is a useful way of looking at the international stage as well at the moment. The European way of looking at things, which focuses on principles and rules, is something that's lacking today, I think. And we need to stand up and represent that way of looking at things on the international stage. We, in Europe, for too long, have not reflected enough on our independence and self-sufficiency. The COVID pandemic has brought this back on the table because we found that we're fragile. Lots of our strategic assets, lots of businesses, lots of sectors find themselves particularly exposed. And that's why I asked the last council meeting of heads of state and government to intervene to ensure that our heritage is protected from speculation. We can't simply sell off all our assets. And I see many vultures looking at the European space, searching out easy acquisitions, but we can't allow that.
Mr. President, the European Parliament emphasized recently that we need a strong Schengen area in a resolution. Do you think that the German presidency will be able to have a reform on this, and will you believe that we will somehow manage to have the accession of
Io non ho capito bene, mi scusi, non ho sentito.
Sorry, I didn't understand you very well. I didn't hear very well through the connection.
Can hear me now?
Sì. Se va avanti.
Yeah, go ahead.
So can you hear me? Perfect. So do you think that the German presidency will be able to manage the reform of the Schengen area in this period, and could we see steps forward for the accession of Bulgaria, Romania, or Croatia to the Schengen area in this time of?
Guardi, io credo che sia interesse di tutti.
Well, I think it's in all of our interests that this process continues. Well, as you know, there are different stages that have to be fulfilled. There are different assessments that have to be made constantly. And, of course, I hope that the whole of Europe can benefit from Schengen. That's also the point of view of the Parliament as well. Of course, that has to be reconciled with progress on the ground. This all has to be assessed properly. But I'm pleased to see that the German presidency has put a lot of weight on moving forward with accession. And I hope that that can help to better integrate citizens and companies and have them draw the full benefits from freedom of movement. I think that's very important. As you know, Parliament has always been very committed to this, and we see all the developments in a positive light.
In this crisis context, what's your opinion about the critical voices that ask for more action from Europe since they find it inexistent?
Non si sente.
I can't hear you. The connection isn't good enough. Could you try again?
Yes. What's your opinion about the critical voices that ask for more action from Europe since they find it inexistent?
Ma dire che l'Europa è inesistente mi sembra.
Well, saying that Europe is non-existent, I mean, seems like simple propaganda coming from people who think they can make it on their own. I mean, there are all kinds of nationalists in Europe. Everyone considers themselves the original European. But we believe that all nations are European. I know there are lots of different ideas, lots of nationalists that see Europe as a bind, something that chains them up. Perhaps they think they're better than their neighbours, but I don't think that's the case. I think that you can do a lot more if you work with your neighbours. I think we would be lost if we tried to go it alone. Everyone would be weaker, more fragile, we'd have fewer resources, less capacities to respond. So this idea of a European going it alone is not something I've ever been persuaded by. I think Europeans do things with other Europeans. We're all Europeans, and I think this is the path that everyone's taking at the moment. But obviously we have to be careful, because nothing lasts forever, nothing is achieved permanently. So we have to always be a bit careful of nationalists and pro-sovereignty, pro-national sovereignty people. I mean, these are people who can just destroy, they can't build.
Abbiamo finito? Sì. Ah, bene. No, bene, era molto divertente.
Oh, we finished. Okay, well, it was a lot of fun. Are there any other questions? No? Great. So thanks ever so much, everyone. And good luck in your work. I hope that we'll see each other again soon.